Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. My name is Chris Burkaw. I'm here to start our program. I'd like to welcome you all here. I'm a partner here at Dorsey and Whitney Law Firm. I lead our corporate practice group in Minneapolis, and much of the work I do is in the area of international business law. My first job after graduating from law school was with a Mexican law firm in Mexico City. So since then, I've had a really strong interest in Latin America, and in recent years, particularly with Cuba. I had the great fortune to visit Cuba in 2015 with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture on a study mission there. And I had lots of ideas about what things might be like there, but seeing it was just an amazing experience. So for any of you who have not had the chance to go there, I highly recommend it. We have a lot of interesting attendees here, a diverse group of folks with different backgrounds. We have Dave Frederickson, who's the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture here. Dave, if you wouldn't mind waving to the group. And with him is Jeff Phillips, who's the International Trade Manager for Food and Agribusiness at the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture is one of the co-sponsors for today's program. The Minnesota Trade Office is also a co-sponsor. It's part of the Minnesota Employment and Economic Development Department. And Rachel Limon is here from the Trade Office. She's in charge of she's the regional trade manager for Latin America and the Caribbean. Rachel, could you stand up so the group can see you? Another co-sponsor today is Global Minnesota, which is a public affairs organization based here in the Twin Cities. Tim Odegaard, the program director for Global Minnesota, is here today. Tim, could you raise your hand? And our last sponsor is the Minnesota Cuba Committee, which is hosting First Secretary Fraga's visit here to Minnesota. And Greg Clavey has been our link to the organization. So thanks to your group as well. We'll be together this morning for about 2 hours. We'll start with introductory remarks from First Secretary Fraga, followed by a panel discussion and a question and answer session with First Secretary Fraga and our two other guest speakers, Paul Johnson from the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba, and David Townsend, an international trade lawyer here at Dorsey and Whitney. Paul and David will give brief opening remarks, which will follow with question and answers with you, the audience. You'll be able to ask questions using the contact cards that you have on your table. My colleagues will come through the room from time to time to collect those. Those of you who are lawyers, there are green sheets on the table. You can sign those in order to qualify for continuing legal education credit. For the rest of you, this is a non-credit program. Sorry. Fortunately, you probably don't need that like lawyers do every year. So to get us started this morning, I'd like to ask Commissioner Frederickson to come up and introduce our honored guest, First Secretary Fraga, and welcome him to Minnesota.
I try to get here at least once a year because I love these pens, and so don't forget to take one home with you when you get there. Is that okay? Can you guys swing the deal? Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Chris and I were able to spend time together in Havana in 2015. I can't believe how quickly the time has flown. I've had the opportunity to be there once a year for the last 3 years to Havana, and what an incredible experience. I am looking forward to a return trip on November 7th with Paul Johnson, who is organizer extraordinaire, and so we're excited about the opportunity to go back to visit Cuba. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Mr. Miguel Fraga, the First Secretary at the Embassy of the Republic of Cuba in Washington, D.C. Mr. Fraga has served at the Embassy of the Republic of Cuba since the reestablishment of diplomatic relations with the United States in July of 2015. Since 2006, he has served in the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs in both the North American and the U.S. Division and the Office of the Minister. From 2008 to 2011, he served at the Cuban Embassy in Canada. And from 2003 to 2008, Mr. Fraga was a member of the People's Power Provincial Assembly of the City of Havana, which is the provincial parliament in Havana. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Havana Faculty of Law in 2003, so you'll be getting credit for this, and earned a Master of Science in Foreign Relations from the Higher Institute of Foreign Relations, Raul Roa Garcia, in 2005. Miguel has presented at a long list of renowned institutions around the United States, including Harvard, Duke, Cornell, the University of Chicago, along with many others. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Minnesota, Miguel Fraga. Please help me welcome Miguel.
Thank you so much and good morning. I didn't know about the pen, but and not even the credit, but it's good to be here. Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me. It's my first time here in Minnesota, and I think it's a good opportunity. I'm sorry for my English. I try to improve every time, you know. I am here, and this is the first message I have today, because we believe relations between Cuba and United States is what the majority of the Cuban people wants, and it's what the majority of the American people wants, and it's also what the majority of the Cuban Americans who live here wants. So I am not an expert in business. You know, Cubans are famous for long speeches, but don't worry, I will be brief. I'm not going to break any record today. And they told me that I have like 20 minutes, so. The idea that I am here is because trying to talk about business opportunities in Cuba and trying to put in context our difficult relations. The ambassador likes to say that in order to do business with Cuba, you need two things: a good heart and a good lawyer. So we are in the right place, I believe. So I'm going to start with a brief presentation trying to put in context. And you know, people believe that as diplomat you are expert in everything about your country. It's not my case, but please do your questions. I will try to answer those questions. This is a brief, again, presentation. You can see that we have the same colors in our flag. And you can see here, this is Washington Memorial, of course, in Washington, D.C., but this is Jose Marti Memorial in Havana. You can see how similar they are. There is a lot of history, you know, between our two countries, and we cannot forget that. And every place I visit, I found common history. I came on Friday, I went to the Twins Stadium, and I met Tony Oliva, you know? So, and let me say this, if we improve the relation, you can have more Cuban players here, and probably you need it. Probably you need it. I have some opening questions for you. What do you know about Cuba? That's the first question, and I think it's very important. You go to many places. I have been in more than 30 universities here in the United States, and when you do that question, you have different answers. People is polite, you know, and people say, okay, Cuba is famous because cigars, because rum. And you say, what else? Well, the missile crisis, well, the Bay of Pigs. And I say, well, that was 50 years ago. What do you know about Cuba? I remember one student in American University that told me, I know about Cuba. And I say, what do you know? And he say, I know I love Lucy. Do you remember? Exactly. And I say, wow. First, you missed the last 50 years. And second, Cuba is not Ricky Ricardo. So the idea is that the good news is he didn't say Scarface, because Cuba is not Tony Montana either. But if you want a good film to understand what was Cuba before 1959, I recommend The Godfather, second part. So the idea is, unfortunately, there is not what I see here is there's not enough information about Cuba. Would you like to visit Cuba? You can raise your hand. How many? That's great. That's a photo that we need. Unfortunately, the other question is, do you consider that Cuba and the United States can have normal relations? The real question is, why not? Oh, because Cuba is a communist country. Okay, but the United States has relations with communist countries. Oh, because Cuba only has one political party. United States has relations with countries that don't allow political parties. So what is the real question? Why we don't have normal relations? Again, it's difficult to explain all these 50 years, but the real point is we want better relations, and for that reason I am here. Have you been in Cuba? You can raise your hand. Okay, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. When you go to the majority of the universities here, that is not what you see. The majority want to go, but the majority has not been able to be in Cuba. So for that reason, my first advice is go to Cuba. Don't believe me. Go to Cuba. See the real Cuba. And that can help a lot. This is our, we have a new president in Cuba. And he came to the United States last month to United Nations. He made a speech there. And this is part of that speech. Cuba stands ready to develop respectful and civilized relations with the United States government on the basis of sovereignty, equality, and mutual respect. This is the will of the Cuban people, and we know this is the shared aspiration by most U.S. citizens, and particularly by Cuban living here. We always say, if the United States is available to sit down with almost every government, why not with Cuba? What is the real reason why we don't sit down? We have many things in common. When I mention communist country, how many soldiers do you lose in Vietnam? You lost 58,000 soldiers. How many in Cuba? We play baseball in Cuba. We have many things in common. So when my president mentioned that the support is here for the relation, I have been told that here in the United States you love polls. You always want to see what people think about something. When according to all the polls, American polls, the majority of the American people wants better relations with Cuba, but also the majority of the Cuban Americans wants better relations with Cuba. And you can see the difference between 1991 and 2016. In 1991, only 14% of support to lifting the U.S. embargo from Cuban Americans in Miami. We have Cuban Americans in all the 50 states. I believe we have like 5,000 here in Minnesota, but we have 348 in Alaska. I don't know what they do there. I don't know what they do here because the weather is so different. But okay, we have Cuban Americans everywhere, but the majority are in Florida and the majority are in the area of Miami. So for that reason, this poll from Florida International University is so interesting for us. But look at this. This is pure research, and you can see all the support in 2015, but also December 2016 for reestablished diplomatic relations, but also for lifting the U.S. embargo against Cuba. But also, and I don't want to show all the polls, but the idea is that the embargo is not anymore a bilateral issue between Cuba and the United States. Almost every country in the world is asking to the United States to lift the U.S. embargo. So it's difficult to defend that policy even with your allies. This is United Nations. You have 193 countries in United Nations. 191 support a Cuban resolution to lift the U.S. embargo. And why I mentioned the U.S. embargo? Well, you have a presentation and they're going to talk about that. The U.S. embargo is the main obstacle to have better relations between Cuba and the United States. That's the problem. There are laws that not allow you to go to Cuba as a tourist, don't allow you to do business with Cuba as you do business with almost every country in the planet. For that reason, I talk so much about the embargo. The embargo costs to Cuba every year $4 billion. That is not money that we don't have. That is money that we have to spend because the embargo is there. And I mentioned that because we buy $2 billion in food. So every year, without the embargo, we have twice the money that we need to buy food, and we can buy many other things. You go to Cuba and you see that we have buses from China. Why? Because it's the only country that sells buses to us, But I'm sure that the weather in China is not the same weather that we have in the Caribbean. But for that reason I mentioned, if we improve the relations with the United States, it's good for both sides, not only for Cuba. There's opportunities that are good for both sides. I'm going to show some examples about that. We have support, and I put these 3 examples because, for example, the Senate in Alabama approved after 2015 a resolution in support of the relation between Cuba and the United States. And everybody say, Alabama? That Republican state? Oh yeah. You know why? Because they mentioned in the resolution that they have a trade relation with Cuba that is about $32 million per year. And I say it's 32 million with the embargo. Imagine without the embargo. We have also all these governors, and you have the lieutenant governor from Minnesota that visit Cuba, and you have governors from both parties, Republicans, Democrat, but also you have different cities here in the United States, and I can point here, Minneapolis, approving resolution for better relation between Cuba and the United States. I met a council member on Saturday, and he told me, I didn't know that means so much for Cuba. And I say, yes, because the majority of Cubans wants better relation with the United States. So even when it's symbolic, it's something important for us. And what I say is, well, I don't see resolutions against the relation. I see the support everywhere I visit. So going more, and the reason that I am here also is to talk about this. We need Congress to improve the relation, to have a really better relation between Cuba and the United States, because we need to change the laws that are right now in place. One of them is about travel. There is a travel ban. In order to go to Cuba, you need a license. You need to qualify in one of the 12 categories. So academic interchange, cultural interchange, religious interchange, journalist, research, but you cannot go as a tourist. And I say, why? You know? So even the cruise that goes to Cuba, they don't qualify as tourists. And it's interesting, you know? For that reason, we have some bills in Congress right now, you know. We are going to have a new Congress next year. But, for example, there is a freedom to travel to Cuba in the Senate, and we have 55 senators behind that bill. And this is not a concession to Cuba. This is about your freedom. But also, we have about trade, freedom to export to Cuba, and Cuba Trade Act 2017. Both bills are from members of the congressional delegation from Minnesota. The one in the Senate, S-1286, is Senator Klobuchar. And the one in the House is Congressman Tom Emmer. So you see that people here is fighting for your rights, is fighting, and I don't see a solidarity with Cuba. You know, I see that they are defending your interests. They are doing that because it's good for you. They understand it's good for you. So this is, I took this from the Congressional Research Service because I don't want you to believe that I am doing Cuban propaganda. So I am using your sources. According to your sources, those are our key partners. And you can see Venezuela, but you can see Canada, and you can see China in the exports in 2016 is the last information, the recent information that you have. And 2016 was a very important year because it's the first year, it's the last year of the previous administration. And you can see in the imports, you have China #1, Venezuela, and Spain. So when somebody comes to our embassy and say, I want to do business with Cuba, how can I do that? I say, ask to the Canadians, because Canada has been doing business with us all the time. We receive 1 million of tourists every year from Canada. And you imagine, we have wonderful relations, trade relations with Canada. That is a model that shows what we can do with the United States. And this is a data from us about how many business delegations we host in 2016, more than 229 business delegations, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, companies went to the trade fair in Cuba, which is in November almost every year. And you can see there is a lot of interest in doing business with Cuba. And I say, you need to go to Cuba. You need to see what you can do in our country. Right now, we have all those airliners traveling to Cuba. We only lost in the major airliners Alaska Air. But right now we have five flights per day between Miami and Havana with American Airlines. And we have other cities with Delta, with JetBlue, with Southwest, and United. Last week we went in Boston because JetBlue is going to start a direct flight between Boston and Havana on November 10. So there are things that are happening. We signed an agreement with the United States that allows 110 flights per day between Cuba and United States, and 20 flights to Havana. And that is wonderful for the United States, you know. We don't have any plane coming to the United States. All the planes are from United States going to Cuba, you know, or American airliners. And for that reason, when people say, okay, this is only good for Cubans, I say it's not like that. We also have all these cruise companies going to Cuba. The majority of the Americans that goes right now to Cuba are going in cruise. I recommend people, yes, go, but if you want to see the country, the cruise is not the best choice to spend time in the country. But every day we receive, almost every day we receive ideas to have more cruises, not only going to Havana, to other places. So even now that the relation is not the same, you see the interest and you see people traveling to Cuba. We sign agreements. Now you can use your cell phone in Cuba. You know, we sign agreements with AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, and those are in place. We sign agreement with Google. Internet is a priority for us, but we don't have the resources. So you have been in Cuba, you know, even if you pay and it's expensive, the connection is not the best. When students go there, they are like crazy because where is internet? Okay, it's slow. But the idea is we are working with Google. We are not afraid of internet. And last year, we signed one agreement with Caterpillar, another agreement with John Deere. We are working with General Electric. We have one hotel right now in Cuba that is running by Marriott. And people say, are you okay with that? I say, well, we have 20 hotels with Spain. Why not with United States, you know? And the other number, and this is something you probably know, Engage Cuba. Engage Cuba is a group that create also a chapter here in Minnesota, and they are talking about how bad it is when you reverse the relations with Cuba, how much can cost that to you. But I want you to see this number. In 2017, we received more than 600,000 Americans in Cuba. But in total, we received more than 1 million because we also have more than 400,000 Cuban Americans traveling to Cuba. So more than 1 million, you are almost like Canada right now in our country. We don't have enough rooms in Cuba, you know, but that's good. That is another opportunity. For that reason, we say we can build some more hotels. It's a good opportunity. And you know, I know that some people don't want the relations. The majority come from that state, Florida, and the interesting part is that they are collecting taxes for doing business with Cuba because the planes come from Florida, the cruise come from Florida. A lot of things that we buy here comes from Florida ports. So it's interesting when they say, no, don't do business with Cuba, but they are doing business with Cuba. So my point is they don't represent the majority anymore, not even in that state. And for that reason, I am here trying to explain that we want better relations, that we are open. The only thing that we want is goodwill and respect. And we can accomplish all that and many other things if we change the embargo. This is something that I want to talk a little bit because I know it's important here. We buy $2 billion in food every year, $2 billion. 70 to 80% of our food. Can you imagine how much we have to pay for transportation when we buy in Asia, when we buy in Europe? Why not here? I always mention, you know, this is a win-win relation. I don't care to put more money in the pockets of your farmers if we can put more food in our table. That is bad. No, we are helping people in both sides. It's not about governments. It's about food. You know, the food that you produce, the food that we eat. I have a wonderful visit to one farm here with the president of the Farm Bureau, Mr. Pap. I drove the combine. There's a video that proves that. I don't know if I did a good job, I'm sorry, but I try to do my best as diplomat, you know. But this is something that I always say. You can see here that in 2008, we buy 600 millions here in the United States. But look how much we buy in other countries. Why? Because we don't have credits here. It's prohibited by law to give credits to Cuba. For that reason, Senator Klobuchar is trying to pass that bill. For that reason, Congressman Emmer is trying to pass that bill. And no, it's not only to help Cuba. It's not about that. It's to improve also the life of the farmers here. I know that people say that the people that defend embargo say that this is about human rights in Cuba. You know what? The embargo is the main violation of the human rights of the whole Cuban people, because it's not affecting the government, you know, it's affecting the people. And for that reason, I ask you, go to Cuba. You go to Cuba and you're going to see that Cubans don't hate Americans. Even despite all these 50 years of difficult relations between Cuba and the United States, Cubans don't hate Americans. You go and you say, I'm from Minnesota, and probably people is going to ask, what about the Twins? What is happening? Why you don't win the World Series? Probably they are going to say, you need Cuban players? And look at this. This is a Cuba Trade magazine. And according to this, they made a research. And they say that in 2016, you didn't have any agricultural sales to Cuba. But there is a potential for 47 millions to 190 millions only here in Minnesota. Probably I can ask to Mr. Pap what you can do with 190 million for your farmers in this country. I can say to you what we can do with that food for our people. So this is, you know, a human. I'm sorry for the passion. We are very passionate in Cuba, but this is something that hurts. You cannot explain why we don't have normal relations with Cuba. We don't have nuclear weapons, you know. We are not a threat for the United States, only in baseball. Only in baseball. But I try to use, you know, the humor, but the idea is that it's a frustration for us after we reestablish diplomatic relations that we cannot have normal relations. And we don't want to wait another 50 years. The moment is now. You know, we don't want to wait more for a better relation. This is another example because people say, oh, with the current administration, we cannot do any business. No, it's not like that. September 26, 2018, Buffalo, New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced Roswell Park Cancer Center has formed this company, Innovative Immunotherapy Alliance SA, the first ever biotech venture between the US and Cuba. We have a good biotech industry. We produce many medicines in Cuba. We produce a cancer vaccine for lung cancer that is right now in New York. And this happened because Governor Cuomo went to Cuba in 2015. He was the first governor after we established diplomatic relations, and he was to Cuba to that. And now, with the current administration, we have the first company ever. So not even before 1959, we had nothing like that, you know? The first company to produce biotech products, and Cuba is very well known for that. So for the end, this is the portfolio of business opportunity that we have right now. They are right now ready for you if you go 456 opportunities for business. Unfortunately, the embargo don't allow you to take advantage of all those opportunities. And for that reason, we need to remove the embargo. But you can see the different sectors that we have business opportunity. I will leave here the portfolio in case that you want. I don't know if you have it, but probably yes. But in case that you want to see all the opportunities that you can have in our country. I start with my president. I want to finish with one your president, President Kennedy, and he was responsible to sign an embargo. Probably you remember the story. The press secretary of President Kennedy wrote one time that one day he received a phone call from the president saying, you have to please buy all the Cuban cigars that you can. Okay, the other day he came, President, mission accomplished, I have 1,400 cigars for you. And he said, okay, now I'm going to sign the embargo. The cigars are not allowed here. He believed that 1,400 cigars were enough. Now, by the way, and this is a commercial, you can go to Cuba, you can bring all the cigars, all the rum for personal use. Somebody told me in Boston, I'm going to bring a humidor with wheels. That is my suitcase. But this is President Kennedy in American University. So let us not be blind to our difference, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our difference, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabited this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. When he said that, he was talking about the Soviet Union. If you can say that to the Soviet Union, why not to Cuba? I know that there is still people that wants to cut the diplomatic relations. They belong to the past, and they are going to miss the future. If we want a better future, we can start today. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for all the time I take.
First Secretary Fraga, thank you for those fascinating remarks. It's easy to lose sight of the human side of our geopolitics, and you really made that clear. We're so close. We don't understand each other very well, but every day we learn more. The next step is for our two other panelists to join First Secretary Fraga at our panel table. The first is Paul Johnson. Paul's the founder of Chicago Foods International, a consulting firm based in Chicago. And he's co-chair of the U.S. Coalition for Cuba, which I hope he'll tell us more about in his remarks. Second is my new colleague, David Townsend. He's an international trade lawyer who just joined us today, by coincidence and good fortune. He's of counsel here in Minneapolis, and he's one of the few, maybe the only trade expert international lawyer here in town. It's a big practice at Dorsey and Whitney, but most of the folks who do international work here in the firm, like me, focus on transactions, whereas David focuses on the regulatory side of our international commerce. So I'll hand it over to Paul. Paul, can you give us some opening remarks?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this great event. I'd like to thank the sponsors as well for hosting this and for everyone being here today. My name is Paul Johnson. I chair a coalition called the United States Agricultural Coalition for Cuba. We represent about 100 national farm groups around the country in our efforts to normalize trade relations with Cuba. I've been working on all things Cuba for the last 20-something years, lived there for a while, did a master's thesis on the economic development of the country back in 1999, started a company and exported food products there, and now I'm working with Congress to help end the embargo and also on my own commercial project to get Cuban fruit imported into the United States. Today, what I want to do is highlight a few key aspects of the present U.S.-Cuba agricultural relationship. I want to start with this program called FMD and MAP funds. FMD are Foreign Market Development, and MAP are Market Access Program federal dollars that agricultural commodity groups use to enter markets. There is an amendment currently in the Farm Bill that would allow us to use those dollars in Cuba. It started with an amendment introduced by Senator Heitkamp out of North Dakota. It was contested by Senator Marco Rubio, and then there was another amendment drawn up that basically reflected the president's directive and regulations stipulating certain restrictions to those funds, but it passed the Senate, and now it's in conference currently. So we're anxiously waiting to see how that goes. It's a small provision and seemingly simple, but the reality is, and the questions that we have is, how far will the agricultural community and how far will our congressmen go to actually support this measure? There are a lot of competing interests within the agricultural community. Attention is often diverted to larger trade issues, of course, the USMCA and China, of course, and that's always a reality when it comes to Cuba. It competes with larger issues, bigger markets for public and congressional attention. There's also concern within the FMD and MAP funds, the people that use these funds, the commodity groups. Some of them are concerned that if we shine a spotlight on these funds and link Cuba into these funds, that those funds could be in the future lessened or decreased. So that's a concern amongst some of the groups that participate in those funds. Personally, I would hope, of course, that it passes and that those in favor of it stay their ground, as this issue has a lot of bipartisan support. Let me tell you a little bit about the significance of this provision, this amendment that's currently in the Farm Bill to allow us to use these funds. It's a small step, but it's a momentum builder to tackling larger issues. It allows us to use federal funds in Cuba. I also believe that the passage of this amendment would allow us to go beyond simple informational exchanges. So when some commodity groups go down using these federal checkoff dollars, they go out into Cuba to market their goods, they can't. They could only use those funds for informational exchanges, which is fairly narrow. So I believe that if we pass this provision, it would broaden the use of those funds in Cuba to include education, research, and promotion. It's also, this amendment represents the first legislation that would be passed on Cuba in 17 years. It's kind of hard to believe, but we haven't passed any legislation on Cuba since the Trade Sanction Reform and Export Enhancement Act, otherwise known as TISR, which passed in 17 years ago, which allowed us to export food products to Cuba. I also think that this provision is another reminder for the U.S. government to be consistent with our trade policy globally. We should be able to use these funds just as we do in every other country around the world. Let me talk about another important task in front of us, or an event that's happening on the agricultural front, and I think we should move into this space. It's continuing to develop this memorandum of understanding that was signed between the United States, USDA, and the Ministry of Agriculture, specifically around plant and animal health certifications. So this MOU allows APHIS, Plant and Animal Health, to work with their counterpart in Cuba to lay down these import-export protocols. And once that's established, these are really the railroad tracks that allow us to increase trade in both directions. Let me move to the midterm elections and how I see that affecting agriculture. A change of leadership could help to actually bring a bill to the floor, but I'd like to add some caution here. This is a bipartisan issue, and the fact is that we need both Democrats and Republicans to pass any significant legislation around Cuba. I would think that given the chance that the first bill that would pass coming out of Congress would be allowing us to use credit, as Miguel had mentioned. We cannot do that in our export of food goods to Cuba currently. You mentioned Congressman Emmer on the House side has a bill that would do just that. On the Senate side, of course, Senator Klobuchar also has a more encompassing bill that would allow us to compete and help us to end the embargo in Cuba. At the administrative level, we all know that the rhetoric is quite tough on this issue, but the policy itself continues to allow for agricultural opportunities. The president himself is of two minds on the Cuba issue. He supported ending the embargo before he was president. And of course, once he assumed office, he declared that he would roll back Obama's initiative. But this has not happened. So a word of caution here, when rhetoric really heats up, and whether that be on the Sonic event or even Venezuela, try to separate the politics in the heated moment from the actual actions and the policy that follow. I do suspect further policy changes to be directed at the commercial arm of Cuba's military, perhaps an expansion of that prohibitive list. Personally, I think that this effort is short-sighted, and we should instead be looking to work with Cuba to resolve regional problems. That being said, the present path forward is via agriculture by expanding these trade and foreign direct investment opportunities that can be linked to support of the Cuban people, specifically with these farm cooperatives. The U.S. State Department views farm cooperatives broadly, with no distinction between types of actual farm cooperatives. And I think that is particularly key as it allows us to work with Cuba's state-run enterprises as long as there is a clear path to supporting the farm cooperatives directly. And I think that fits Cuba's interests as well, so that is a space forward within the present policy. Long-term, let me take a step back here and talk about the long-term prospects. I had an opportunity to meet with Cuba's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, when he was at the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago. We had breakfast and we talked about, I introduced this idea of having a joint vision report where we could talk about the future of U.S.-Cuba agricultural relationships, talk about where we are going, what do we hope to achieve, what has the past taught us to build a better relationship tomorrow. So right now we're so focused on, and rightfully so, on the details of today, but we often lose sight of what it is we want from this relationship. And I think that's particularly important as it provides us an opportunity to change the present narrative and to add a bit of imagination and creativity to an otherwise stale and ineffectual policy. So we continue to develop this joint report with Cuba, which I obviously am personally excited about because it gets us a chance to really get into the weeds and start talking about history, Cuban agricultural identity, two-way trade, post-harvest loss, organic versus conventional farming, mechanization, foreign direct investment, supply chain logistics, shared natural resources, comparative advantage trading, north-south development and south-south development. And what I mean by that is working within the agroecological movement in Cuba while tapping into global capital markets. Let me downshift here and talk about what I think is a good starting point for the folks in this room to focus your attention and help to expand our government's viewpoint of Cuban agriculture, which starts by seeing the agricultural cooperative as Cuba's economic form of production. I know I mentioned this earlier. I'm coming back to it because I think it's relevant today. The policy within Cuba is for cooperatives to be more decentralized and democratic, or what Cuba would call participatory socialism. Decentralized is the idea that these farm cooperatives have more autonomy in decision-making. It's being pulled away from the ministerial level. The U.S. policy focuses on support for the Cuban people, which is directed towards largely the self-employed sector you've probably heard about. So some reforms that took place under President Raul Castro in 2011, they wanted to open up the private sector, have more people get into their own jobs. And so the United States also moved into this space to promote that effort as well. But we need to work with Cuba to equally focus our attention on the cooperative formation. Self-employed sector is really important. It includes around 550,000 Cubans today, or less than 10% of the Cuban workforce. So Cuba is always asking themselves, what about the other 90% of the workforce? Farm cooperatives alone include about 450,000 people. However, the ceiling for that to grow is a lot higher than the self-employed sector. Not everyone can own their own job. It's unrealistic to think that they can. Not everybody has access to remittances or capital or the know-how or the wherewithal to open up your own business. Self-employed sector in the United States is about 7%. So the point is we need to move into this cooperative space. I think they're particularly key in improving economic production in Cuba. Certainly, the folks here in the room in Minnesota understand the strength and power of cooperatives. You know, I don't need to name all the big cooperatives here in Minnesota. You understand that formation better than most folks in the country, and certainly better than our policymakers. Let me conclude here by saying that Minnesota's support is really key in all of this. You are leaders across the country on this issue. You have both senators that are actively engaged and who have been to Cuba. I had the opportunity of going to Cuba with Senator Smith not that long ago. Congressman Emmer, we have mentioned, has a very important bill circulating in Congress. Agricultural Commissioner Dave Frederickson is a true champion on this issue. I look forward to going back to Cuba with you in November. Kevin Papp, president of the Minnesota Farm Bureau, has been particularly active on this issue. He has also been to Cuba. Chris Burkaw, you certainly have the expertise to help the folks in this room. So what I want to just conclude with is that while you're looking for commercial opportunities in Cuba, work with the tremendous resources that you have here at home and be the leader. It's an incredible opportunity for Minnesota. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Reminder to the audience, you got your Q&A cards at the tables. We want this to be an open and challenging discussion. So you're hearing a lot of the positives about the relationship, but you know, we've all got questions and some may have doubts. So don't hesitate to ask the hard questions too. And David, before you start, I just want to read you one of the questions that I think is a perfect lead into your segment, which is, where did I put that card? Just give me a second. Bear with me. Oh, here it is. How is it that there are business agreements with Cuba for trade in pharmaceutical, internet, heavy equipment, tourism, and the hospitality industries? How is it that we can do that despite the restrictions of the embargo?
Great. Thanks, Chris. My name's Dave Townsend. I'm counsel here at Dorsey and Whitney as of about 45 minutes ago.
We'll see how this goes.
Yeah, well,
we'll have a vote at the end. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Chris was joking last night. He said that because we do want to leave a good amount of time for people to ask questions and have a discussion up here, that if I didn't keep my presentation short enough, I could just pack my bags and go home and forget it. So I'll do my best. That is a great question. It's a great lead-in. The short answer to it is that there are carve-outs in the sanctions regulations that allow for transactions such as those named in that card, and they're industry-specific and they're subject to pretty strict conditions, which we'll talk a little bit about here in my presentation. So very briefly, I've been working on export controls and economic sanctions for a little over 8 years. Most of the work I've done is helping companies with compliance-related questions on economic sanctions and export controls. Cuba presents unique problems among the other sanctions programs. You know, if you look at the sanctions that we have with respect to Iran, Syria, North Korea, the other list-based sanctions, the Cuban sanctions are particularly troublesome to deal with for companies that are participating in global supply chains, and they're unique in many respects. The Cuban embargo it's territorial based, which means U.S. persons generally can't do anything with respect to Cuba unless it's explicitly authorized by law. And as I mentioned, those authorizations are conditional and limited, and there are requirements that people have to take a look at before they move forward with transactions. One of the things we're going to talk a little bit about in my presentation are the changes that the Obama administration made, as well as the more recent changes by the Trump administration. And to a certain extent, there was a rollback there of the efforts by the Obama administration, but it's certainly not wholesale. And the policy is remarkably similar between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, at least in terms of what sectors and what the goals of the sanctions are, which is notable, given that, as the people before me mentioned, there's not much that President Obama and President Trump agree on. And the basic point here is First Secretary Fraga did a great job of emphasizing is that there are opportunities there. There are opportunities there for U.S. companies. The presentation by First Secretary Fraga was great because it gave you specific examples of companies and how they're taking advantage of these licenses to do business in Cuba, or at least to start the process of doing business in Cuba. And I think it's safe to say that Minnesota's economy, given its very heavily oriented towards agriculture, medical devices, the exceptions and licenses under the Cuban sanctions, really, there's a lot to benefit from there for the state of Minnesota and companies that are here. So the basic prohibitions I've summarized here with respect to Cuba. It's territorial, very broad, exceedingly broad. It's the broadest sanctions program there is. It applies to traded goods, it applies to services, it applies to currency, it applies to travel, it applies to technology transfers. And it also, as with all sanctions programs, there are provisions in place to prevent U.S. persons from circumventing or skirting the sanctions by referring business elsewhere that they can't directly participate in. So as I said, the starting point with Cuban sanctions is everything is prohibited unless explicitly authorized. So the more interesting aspect of the Cuban sanctions are looking at the licenses and where there is space for interpretation and space for businesses to undertake commerce between the countries. A couple notable aspects of the Cuban sanctions. As you've heard this morning, only Congress can repeal the Cuba sanctions. That's somewhat different than our other sanctions programs. Congress has passed a number of statutes that effectively codify sanctions that were implemented under prior presidents. So the president can't revoke the Cuban sanctions to a large extent without the involvement of Congress. They apply to foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies. That is unique under sanctions programs. They generally do not apply to foreign subsidiaries, although that has changed in recent years with respect to Iran. But under the Cuba sanctions, they explicitly apply to U.S. Subsidiaries operating outside of the United States. So a lot of companies have faced compliance challenges because of that. The sanctions apply to travel. That's, again, because of the statute under which the sanctions are authorized. And another problematic area, at least with respect to helping companies comply with Cuban sanctions, is that there's really dual jurisdiction between the Department of Treasury and the Commerce Department. The Office of Foreign Assets Control within the Department of Treasury handles many aspects of the Cuban sanctions, but not all of them. There's also significant jurisdiction under the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. So a lot of times if we're asked to look at whether a particular transaction can move forward, you have to look at both the OFAC regulations and the BIS regulations. And there are particular aspects of a given transaction that might fall within different jurisdictions. So a few of the key authorizations here with respect to Cuba. Agriculture, which we heard from Paul. There's a general license exception under the BIS regulations, the Export Administration Regulations, or the EAR, that allow ag trade to happen between the countries. We'll see that that license represents easily the highest value of transactions, at least exports from U.S. to Cuba are under the ag license. Medical devices and medicine, There's a policy of approval for an export license for medical devices and medicines under the BIS regulations. So that allows medical device maker to apply to BIS and receive permission to move forward with a transaction with Cuba. There's a good amount of exports from the United States of medical devices. And then telecommunications is another significant one. And First Secretary Fraga, in one of his slides, showed you the companies who are taking advantage of that. And it is significant. It involves some of the biggest U.S. companies who are able to have limited transactions with Cuba under that license. So the Obama administration, as I'm sure almost everyone in the room knows, made significant changes with respect to Cuba. Probably the biggest was establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. In addition, the Obama administration wanted to do something substantive with respect to the sanctions to change them. And they had a tough time doing that because most of the sanctions are established by Congress by statute. So they had really a limited room to maneuver in terms of changing the general policy of the territorial embargo with respect to Cuba. So they came up with a few licenses that are unique under economic sanctions program, particularly the support for the Cuban people license. And I've summarized that broad brush here, but it's really designed to promote economic activity or to allow commerce between the United States and Cuba limited to transactions with Cuban entities that are independent of the Cuban government. And that stems from longstanding asset freezes that the Cuban sanctions have with respect to many Cuban government entities. So the Obama administration looked at that and came up with this, which is a way to authorize certain economic transactions with Cuba. And likewise, they're aimed at transactions to promote civil society, improving communications, and then temporary exports that are relevant to those same authorizations. And then probably the biggest change that affects the most people is travel. That was the big change under the Obama administration. Significantly expanded the ability to travel to Cuba by U.S. persons from the United States. And then there is a license for joint ventures doing research with Cubans to gain FDA approval and for Cuban origin pharmaceuticals, which was called out in the question that Chris led to begin my presentation. And then the Trump administration, more recently, just under a year ago, November 2017, made a couple of significant changes. They created this State Department list that U.S. persons are not allowed to have any transactions with. The list is designed to target the Cuban military intelligence and security services, but there are a lot of entities that you wouldn't think are involved in those activities, such as hotels, soft drink manufacturers, rum companies, because of their ownership were deemed to be part of the Cuban military intelligence and security services, according to the State Department. And that adds another layer of complexity. If you're doing transactions or attempting to figure out whether you're allowed to move forward with economic activity with Cuba, you now have to look at this list in addition to the other screening and conditions of the general licenses that you're operating under or specific licenses. So you have to screen against that list to make sure you're not inadvertently dealing with one of the entities on the U.S. State Department list. That list does not include entities that are 50% or more owned or controlled by the entities called out on the State Department list. That's a departure from the Department of Treasury's OFAC's usual policy, so that's a little different. But it does add a layer of due diligence. And then there were significant conditions put on travel, although it wasn't a wholesale repeal by any means of what the Obama administration had done, nor was it a wholesale reversal of the travel authorizations. And I mean, I think what's significant about what the Trump administration has done, and reading the tea leaves about where they may go in the future, is that they sort of accepted the Obama administration changes on its terms, right? They said, okay, we agree that it's okay for U.S. persons to have economic activity where certain sectors of the Cuban economy, but not all of it. And we're going to help identify which parts are off limits. So, you know, there is sort of a shared now kernel of policy between both the Obama administration and the Trump administration on Cuban sanctions. And that leaves in place a lot of opportunities that remain on the books for U.S. companies to do business with Cuba. Summarize the travel authorizations here. Each one of these 12 has their own specific regulation that you have to read very carefully to make sure, if you're trying to take advantage of it, that you're operating within the terms of. It allows transactions that are incident to travel and certain travel services. I mean, one thing that's interesting with the State Department list when you look at the travel authorizations that remain on the books is that there are hotels that are off limits to U.S. persons, so you have to be careful about where you're staying. You have to be careful. We were talking last night in preparation for this panel about how you have to bring cash with you to Cuba because you're not going to be able to use your credit cards. That's a great example of something that's not necessarily required by the Cuban sanctions, but from a banking perspective, they've just said we're not going to service credit cards in Cuba. It's too much work for us. We can't tell whether somebody's conducting their transactions in accordance with the Cuban sanctions, so it's not worth the trouble. Here are several other notable licenses. Business and physical presence are authorized for companies that are operating within the confines of general licenses. So that's what has allowed permanent presence by U.S. businesses in Cuba. There's a license for humanitarian projects. There's a license for importation of goods produced by Cuban entrepreneurs. That's sort of a curious license in the sense that if you look at the trade data, there are no imports of Cuban origin goods, which means a couple of things. It means that there's not large-scale commercial importations from Cuba because that would show up in the data, but as First Secretary Fraga mentioned, you can bring back Cuban origin items. It's not as though there are no Cuban origin items in the United States consistent with the law. There are. You can bring them back when you're traveling as long as they're for personal use and not for any commercial purpose. And then financial transactions remain authorized for underlying transactions that are pursuant to a license. So if you can show a bank that what you're doing is consistent with a license, generally you should be able to receive payment for that as long as you're not dealing with blacklisted entities, many of which are from Cuba. So I've put up a very broad brush summary of U.S. exports to Cuba. This isn't going to capture any of the services that a lot of what First Secretary Fraga was showing you are service-related transactions. That doesn't show up in the data here. But in 2017, there were 282 million in exports to Cuba. 2018, it's down slightly on the aggregate level. 90 to 90% of this is in the agricultural sector. You can see what the remainder is in there. The U.S. International Trade Commission published a study in 2016 that attempted to model what would be possible for U.S. companies to trade, to export to Cuba if the embargo were lifted entirely. They came up with $1.4 billion annually. So if you look at that, we're talking about more than a tripling of the value of goods that we could send to Cuba if the embargo were lifted. That report also identified some of the key impediments, which you've heard about already today, restrictions on marketing funds, payment restrictions. Obviously, the travel and investment restrictions prevents U.S. companies from fully taking advantage of the Cuban market. in part just because it's difficult to establish good commercial relationships when you are only able to travel to Cuba under limited circumstances. To conclude, some of the compliance challenges that remain for U.S. companies, I'm still amazed how frequently we run into companies that are unaware that foreign subsidiaries of a U.S. company can't do business with Cuba. If you have a European company that's a joint venture with a U.S. company who's producing all European origin goods with all European citizens, and they ship that to Cuba, that's a violation. And you can face significant penalties for that. And I think there's at least from the European perspective or non-US perspective, there's sort of confusion that OFAC sanctions could reach that far, but they do. And they do because of the statute under which the sanctions are authorized. There are a lot of companies, so we saw examples of companies that have moved to begin the process or are already doing business with Cuba. But there are a lot of companies that have looked at this and said, we don't think we're 100% safe in moving forward with this, or that there are risks inherent in doing business with Cuba that they aren't willing to tolerate, one of which is the prospect that the sanctions could be reversed. So those licenses by the Obama administration, in theory, could be completely wiped out. So if you want to start a long-term relationship with Cuba, it's a risk because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. And when you're trying to operate under those licenses, there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done, and at times you get to the point where if you're not 100% sure that you're going to be able to meet the terms of the license, then it's not worth the risk. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and look forward to having more discussion related to the question you all have. Thanks.
So I guess you can stay, right? All right.
Thanks, Chris.
Got some great questions from the audience. Thank you. For that, I just want to tell you that we're making an audio recording of this program, and so that and the slides should be available on the website, our website, Dorsey.com, if all goes well. So you'll have that for reference in the future, or to share with other people who you think might be interested in the subject matter. So here's a question from the audience, and I'll direct it to the panel, but probably start with First Minister Fraga, or First Secretary Fraga. The question is, aren't you exaggerating the U.S. embargo's economic impact on Cuba? You can trade freely, Cuba can trade freely with every other country in the world. Are you using the embargo as an excuse for a failed system?
Thank you so much. I think it's a wonderful question. Every year in United Nations, for the last 25 years, we present a resolution asking support for the end of the U.S. embargo. Our ambassador, our foreign minister comes to New York, present the resolution, ask for the support. Your representative go after and say, this is the excuse that the Cuban use to cover all the failures in the economic that they have. And our foreign minister say, thank you so much for giving us an excuse. Why you don't remove the excuse? If it's only one excuse, why you don't remove the excuse? As I mentioned before, I was thinking when David mentioned, people don't understand that the embargo is not only between Cuba and the United States. It's not true that we can do business with other countries in the world freely, because we are living in an economy that is connected everywhere. You can go to OFAC and you can see the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the Department of Treasury here. There is a website and you can see the sanctions to banks in Paris for doing business with Cuba. So it's not true that is only a bilateral issue between Cuba and the United States. And the other issue is even your allies, the European Union, Canada, almost every country in the world, you only have another country that support the U.S. embargo. You know which country is? Israel. Out of 193, 191 asking to the United States to lift the embargo. I remember I did a similar presentation to the former members of Congress Association at the Hill in Washington. And somebody asked me, okay, you have many problems. You need better infrastructure, you need a better economy, you have all this. If we remove the embargo tomorrow, what do you say to the people that in the United States that want to do business with Cuba? And I say, well, if you remove the embargo tomorrow and you don't come, somebody's going to take your place. Because right now, yes, we are doing business with companies, but they want more. They want more space, they want more trade with Cuba, but the restrictions are affecting those countries. So, and again, I'm sorry for the passion, but it's not true to say that there's only one excuse. And you can read President Obama last State of the Union speech talking about this and saying the majority want better relations, the majority want to see the end of the embargo. 50 years of embargo has failed, and you keep doing the same? So it's not an excuse, not at all. And if we are talking about that, let's talk about freedom. Why you cannot go to Cuba? Why you need a license to go to Cuba? So there are many things that we can talk about that, but for sure it's not an excuse, and it's affecting other countries, other banks, and can you imagine that, for example, we cannot buy nothing in the world that have more than 10% of American components? What that means, almost everything has more than 10% of American components in today's world. President Obama changed a little bit about that, but I'm talking the last 50 years. So we cannot buy planes, we cannot buy almost nothing. Everything, phones, nothing, because of the US embargo. So it's not an excuse. Sorry for that. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great points. And one of the things that frequently comes up that we're asked by companies who are looking at developing a global compliance policy that captures all of their operations around the world is under what circumstances can a U.S. item go to a foreign entity that then incorporates it into something that's shipped to all over the world? And do we have to block that from going to Cuba? And the answer often, at least sometimes, is yes. You know, so the International Trade Commission figures that I put up on the exports to Cuba, that's not capturing that third country trade that's prohibited. That's not capturing U.S. from foreign subsidiaries that are not allowed to do business with Cuba. So it is much broader than just direct transactions between the two territories.
Got a question for Paul, somewhat related, which is one of the challenges of doing business in Cuba is the significant impact or involvement of the Cuban government, both in terms of state-owned enterprises, but also just regulation of the economy that's maybe more significant there than many parts of the world. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, you know, I'd tell you, bureaucracy, I don't care what country it is, it's always a pain, right? I mean, it's difficult no matter what country you go to, including this country, but it's half the equation. You've got to go through the bureaucracy in order to get a project completed. And Cuba's no different than that. It's gotten better over the last 10 years, I could tell you that. It's particularly in this constitutional reforms, when I mentioned this earlier, they're giving more autonomy to these commercial entities and these cooperatives away from the ministerial level. That has been a significant change. I'd certainly like to see more of that in Cuba. But these commercial entities, they're more empowered, so the discussion's much different than it used to be. It's not so much about 1962. It's more about, you know, how do we make this work today? I could also complain about the U.S. bureaucracy. I've been working on this project for one particular project to get Cuban fruit into the United States for about 3 years, working with the interagencies, Commerce and Treasury and USDA and State Department and up to the NSC. And it's, as you all know, it's very difficult to get agencies working together on a common project. But again, I think those challenges are inherent in pretty much every country you go to.
Other thoughts from the panel? We've got plenty more questions.
Something about baseball? No.
After the program.
Okay.
Question of the panel, I think maybe starting with David. How many prosecutions of U.S. exporters have occurred under the embargo?
I don't know the number, but it is a lot. The typical fact pattern that you'll see with respect to violations of the Cuban assets control regulations under OFAC are not a U.S. company shipping to Cuba. I think U.S. companies generally understand they can't do that, and there are a few oddball cases where somebody was hiding things on their export documents to attempt to do business with Cuba. Typically, the prosecutions that you're seeing are of non-U.S. companies. First Secretary Fraga mentioned that with respect to the banks. I think it was J.P. Morgan was fined 2 weeks ago. And those fines are typically processing transactions that are, a European company attempting to do business with, or doing business with Cuba, that a financial transaction is then processed in the United States. And the J.P. Morgan apparently didn't, at one time, they were long ago violations, but they didn't have screening procedures in to block those transactions. So it's not typically U.S. exporters, it's typically countries, third country entities that are doing business with Cuba or some sort of tangential U.S. involvement in transactions with Cuba.
Another question. What are the obstacles to congressional passage of laws to end the food credit and tourism restrictions? Who wants to take that one?
What are the, well, I mentioned a couple of them. It's always trying to capture the congressional and the public attention on Cuba. There's just larger issues, particularly amongst the agricultural community. That's a reality that we face. But in my experience talking with congressmen across the board, the majority of them are clearly in favor of ending the embargo. I think part of that challenge is getting leadership to actually introduce a bill. I firmly believe that if a bill was introduced, that it would pass in both the Senate and the Congress. I think most of the American people, just don't understand this policy. It obviously hasn't benefited the American citizens or Cuban people. But I think the challenge that we face is getting it to leadership right now is the number one challenge.
Another question. Is it becoming easier to form a small or medium-sized company in Cuba?
I think the small, medium-sized companies, I kind of like that model. I know the big ABCDs, the big companies are doing some work there, and I think that works for Cuba too, to demonstrate that, Caterpillar and John Deere or Cargill has been doing business in Cuba. That certainly shows the world that they're open for business. But I always thought that the small and medium-sized business has the best chance of doing some real good work in Cuba because they have the ingredients that it takes. What were the two you called? The heart and a good lawyer, right?
Yes.
That's a big part of it. And also, going back to your idea of risk, I think smaller and medium-sized companies could understand that risk a lot better because they go into the relationship seeing this as long-term. Cuba market is not for everybody. It's for those who have the heart and have the long-term understanding of trying to build that relationship. So just to conclude again, I think that small, medium-sized entities got a better chance of navigating the waters in Cuba.
Another question. What do the OFAC regulations say about Cubans in the U.S., either as U.S. citizens or as legal permanent residents owning property in Cuba? Do the regulations grandfather in that ownership? We may be able to stump the panel on this one.
Yeah.
Let's see.
That is a tough question. There are a lot of exceptions under both OFAC and BIS regulations for U.S. Cubans who are lawfully resident or become citizens of the United States. Once a person becomes a citizen of the United States, the sanctions generally, they're free to do whatever they want, but not with respect to property in Cuba. And the property in Cuba and any transaction relating territorially between the United States and Cuba would give OFAC jurisdiction to potentially charge someone with if they were doing something contrary to the sanctions. So you'd have to look at the general license exceptions. There are remittance exceptions. There are some provisions for inheritances, so that may be an option if you had property in Cuba, but you'd have to be very careful and you'd have to look at the license and make sure whatever you thought might apply was clearly applicable.
Hard to choose among these. Here's an interesting one. They're all interesting, but this is something we haven't talked about, which is we've not heard much during the Trump administration about Guantanamo Bay. Does Cuba view the U.S. or how does Cuba view the U.S. presence on Guantanamo?
Well, it's a very important question. We said in 2015, okay, we reestablished diplomatic relations with the United States, but we don't have normal relations. There is many things that we need to do in order to have normal relations. One of them, of course, number one, embargo, the blockade, but number two is Guantanamo. You have a base there, a military base, that is not strategic anymore, that is sent to a treaty that is not a fair treaty. Imagine that according to the treaty, you can be there forever, even if we don't want it. You know how much you pay for the base to the government of Cuba? $4,000 per year. And it's not about the money, you know? And the territory that you have there is twice the territory of Manhattan. The idea is that that is Cuban territory. We want it back. We don't want any military base in Cuba. But in this case, we really believe that it's our territory. And the treaty, again, that was signed many years ago, first at the beginning of the 20th century, and in 1934 we did another treaty, allows the United States to be there forever, even if we don't want. By the way, we don't collect the money that you pay for the base because we don't want the base. But that is a very important issue. Nevertheless, we don't want to have excuses to don't have normal relations. So the idea is even when we have difference, we are open to sit down and talk, and we can work together, even with the base there. That is our official position.
Another question. The human rights issue is important, and it still lurks in the background of the Cuba-U.S. relationship. Should corporations exert pressure on Cuba to expand human rights in exchange for corporations exerting pressure on Congress to lift the embargo?
I cannot talk for the companies, the American companies. I can talk for my government. What I want to say is, go to Cuba. When you go to Cuba, you're going to see what human rights we are talking about. The idea that I always said is Cuba is not perfect, but we have many things that we are proud of. And human rights is not an issue in Cuba. And the only way that you can see that if you go to Cuba. And by the way, the United States has relations with countries that violate the human rights. And there is not an embargo there. I mentioned one day to one journalist that made an interview to me in Montana, and I don't know why this ended in the USA Today. He told me, what about the human rights? And I say, well, what I said before, the embargo is the main violation of the human rights. But by the way, I never saw the United States to put an embargo to Pinochet in Chile, to Somoza in Nicaragua, to all the real dictators, even Batista, who killed 20,000 Cubans in 7 years. And the United States never put an embargo there. So if you go, and I know that it's freedom of the press and all that, go to the museum in DC. There is a database there, and you can put journalists that are killed in all the countries in the world. The last journalist killed in Cuba was in 1958, according to the museum, during the Batista regime. So there is a lot of misinformation about the human rights in Cuba. And for that reason, I remember one Cuban American that told me, I went to Cuba, and yes, I saw a lot of, problems in the economy, but I was expecting to see a military in every corner with a big gun, and that doesn't happen in Cuba. So my advice is, again, don't believe me. Go to Cuba. And the other thing I want to say is that when you say helping the Cuban people and about democracy, you are sending money to Cuba for the so-called human rights fighters. So for some people in Cuba, this is a way of life. And for that reason, there is people here that defend the blockade. Not because they care about the Cuban people, because the blockade is affecting the Cuban people. It's because this is a way of life. There is a congresswoman here in Minnesota, Betty McCollum, that presented a bill in the last Congress, in the 114th Congress, about, I don't know if you know what is TV Martí, Radio Martí, and Martí Noticias. You pay, because it's taxpayer money, since 1983 to promote propaganda against Cuba. And that cost to you more than $700 million since 1983, according to Congresswoman Betty McCollum. So you send money to promote democracy in Cuba, and it's money to create that kind of human rights fighters. But you don't see in the news that we kill anybody. You don't see in the news. Even those human rights fighters come to the United States, to the US Congress, to ask for more blockade. So the human rights question is a real excuse to don't have normal relation between Cuba and the United States. I invite everybody to go to Cuba, to all the places that you want. Thank you.
Paul?
I think that, first of all, we need to be consistent with our trade policy. If we're going to trade with Saudi Arabia, if we're going to trade with Venezuela, or rather, not Venezuela, with China, then we can certainly trade with socialist Cuba. I don't think the United States is afraid of doing business with countries whose policies don't mirror our own. I think as a businessman, though, through our example, that we can certainly encourage and advocate for a more open Cuban society, stronger civic debate in institutions, independent press, and an independent judiciary. But I think it is important to remind ourselves that, first of all, we cannot improve the rights of Cubans by restricting the rights here of our own U.S. citizens not to travel and do trade in Cuba. I personally believe that reform for Cuba needs to come from within rather than from without. In order for change to be lasting anywhere, it needs to be local. So, Cubans should be the ones determining their own political future, and it's, in my opinion, not in the United States' interest to be meddling with the internal politics of other countries. If we continue to do that, we're going to find ourselves right back where we were back in 1959.
Kind of along the same lines as what Paul was just saying, I think that if you were talking about trade-related or trade aspects of human rights and how trade policy fits within the goal of promoting human rights, there's a long, that's not a new issue for the United States. There is the International Labor Organization that has standards that has trade-related aspects to it. Human rights was a central issue in many of the free trade agreements that we negotiated with countries that had a less than stellar human rights record. Colombia comes to mind as one where we were negotiating hard on human rights related issues. So I guess one way to look at it is engagement going to promote human rights, or is lack of engagement going to promote human rights? And that's a policy decision, one that Congress needs to make. But there are sort of paths to improve human rights under the existing trade architecture.
Thanks. Got an interesting question that's I didn't know about until I traveled to Cuba, and probably most people don't know about, which is, and the question is, are there still separate currency systems for Cuban citizens and for foreign visitors? So when the person who wrote the question visited Cuba 2 years ago, citizens with whom he or she spoke hoped that the dual currency and separate stores and shops for citizens and visitors would cease, so that the extensive black market of currency, accepting U.S. dollars from U.S. citizens, Canadian dollars, et cetera, for goods from Cuba. So can one of you explain that system and how it works both positively and maybe negatively in Cuba?
I can start with one idea. There is not two different currencies for the people, and so the people can use both. Well, it's not only for foreigners, for tourists. People can use both. We have to remember that in 1991, we lost 80% of our trade overnight. The Soviet Union collapsed, the communist countries disappeared, and we lost 80% of our trade overnight. We start a special period, a very difficult moment in the economy, with blackouts, with lack of food, many things, and we create this double currency. Right now, the majority of the people of Cuba don't want that, and there is a commitment to eliminate that. But we need to do it without, and in the process, we don't want to create more problems, more difference among the people. We are doing many changes in Cuba. There is a new president. We are working in a new constitution that is going to be next year. So there are many things happening in our country, and we don't want to do things so quick that we cannot avoid the problems that this is going to bring. But as a representative of my country, I can say that the majority don't want that, because create difference, create problems, and there is a commitment from the government to eliminate that. So at some point, we are going to have only one currency, the Cuban peso, and we are working on that.
Yeah, this issue comes up a lot. I hear it a lot in Congress as well. Cuba is sincere about trying to merge these two currencies. So you have one currency that's worth about 25 times more than the other. To your point, you can go to supermarkets now and purchase goods both in the CUP and the CUC, both currencies. The problem is that, how do you do it? So someone's going to lose, right? Who's ever got more of the higher value currency, someone who's got the lower value currency. When you start to merge them, someone's going to wake up one day and say, my peso is not worth as much. And that's really the fear amongst Cuban economists. And the debate is, do you do that really quick, or do you do it gradually and slowly? And there's a big debate happening in Cuba how to do that. And I know they're getting some outside assistance to figure that whole thing out. Mm-hmm. But inflation, scarcity of goods, what happens when you merge those two currencies is going to have a tremendous impact on the daily lives of Cuba. So I think we should caution and give them the space they need and the expertise to do that. But I know that Cuba is working sincerely to merge those currencies. They're going to have to.
We had two questions about what happened a year or two ago, the sonic or other injuries to personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. So the question is, how does Cuba explain the health issues that people suffered at the embassy? How have you analyzed that, and how do you interpret it?
This is a very important issue. Right now is a real obstacle for the relations. You know that after that, the administration decided to remove almost everybody in your embassy, and they expelled 60% of our diplomats here. Since the beginning, we said we offer full cooperation. We don't know what happened. We need to work together. For that reason, the FBI have been in Cuba 4 times. It's the first time in more than 60 years that the FBI is allowed to enter to Cuba. And they bring all the equipments, they did all that they want. You cannot see in the media that the FBI is complaining about any lack of cooperation from Cuba. Unfortunately, the people that don't want the relation is using this. We see a political manipulation of this. And what I say this, I am a diplomat. I try to build relations, not to destroy. For the reason I am respectful, I don't want to say nothing that offend anybody. But you know that this not only happened in Cuba, there is another country that also a U.S. diplomat suffered from this. And you can see that there is not the same response to that country that to Cuba. And by the way, this, according to what the American government has said to Cuba, this is starting November 2016, but we only learned about this like 5 months after. When you talk about sonic attack, the FBI have come back and say, you cannot talk about sonic attack. There is not such weapon. There is not possible to hurt one people in the room and not the rest of the people. You know, if you are a family and you live together, or you are in the same room, how can you explain that this affect you and not affect the other people? And the noise that you have to create is amazing to produce the damage that they describe. The other thing is that we're talking, according to, again, to what the American government say, about 26 diplomats. They don't present the same symptoms. There is different symptoms. We are asking to have access to that evidence. They say that is not possible. We bring 9 Cuban scientists to United States, to the State Department to talk about that, because they present an article in the Journal of Medicine here in the United States, but after that, that same journal published like 14 letters from scientists all around the world criticizing that first article. And by the way, you see that right now, they're not, even the media is not talking about sonic attack. They changed the narrative, and right now it's microwave. In order to do that with microwave, you have to burn people. You have to see, because imagine it's flesh, you know. Microwave to damage the brain. You have to see the burn at some point. And again, why you damage, you cause this only to one person that live among other people. So we believe that there has not been enough cooperation. Since the beginning was the idea of this is an attack, and at some point the US government say, okay, we don't say that Cuba is responsible, but Cuba is responsible of the security of the diplomats in Cuba. We are responsible for that since the intersection was reopened in 1977. In the Cold War, there is not a single case of a US diplomat that suffered any attacks in Cuba. So why now? And they say, well, it's the third country. Where's the evidence? There is a report that is talking about anonymous sources, and they talk about the Russians. Where's the evidence? Why you don't share that with us? We don't want another excuse to avoid relation between Cuba and United States. And we say we need to work together. But unfortunately, there is people using this for political purposes, and it's damaging right now, because you saw the travel warning alert from the State Department. Now that changed, but you don't have nobody in your embassy right now. Sometimes the delegations that comes from the United States are bigger than the staff that you have right now in the U.S. Embassy. So this is a real issue that is making a lot of damage, and it's not good, and we don't want it. We are open to work with the United States, and again, we don't say that nothing happened, because some media say, okay, the Cubans are denying everything. No, 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 no. We say that we don't know what happened, that we need to work together, but please don't use this for political purposes. Let's work together. And by the way, I really believe those are colleagues, you know? I don't want nothing happen to my people here in our embassy. And I don't know if you are aware that a Cuban diplomat was killed in New York in 1980, a Cuban diplomat that was in the United Nations Cuban embassy, and he was killed in 1980 in New York. Nothing like that happened to your diplomats in Cuba, because we don't allow that. Thank you.
You know, it really is important. So let me just add a couple things into it. You know, right now we don't know who did it. We don't know how they did it. So this unknown allows folks in Congress who are pro-embargo to continue rolling back the détente between the two countries. And as you mentioned, the United States, in order to protect the diplomats overseas correctly, brought those diplomats back home. So we're working with a shell of a staff in the U.S. Embassy. It's a real problem because they were overworked before, and now they don't have the staff. And of course, to reciprocate, the United States expelled a number of Cuban diplomats in D.C. So it's very difficult to talk about academic exchanges or commercial exchanges. I think what we need to do is, we need to, number one, bring these perpetrators to justice. So we need to focus on who did it, because we can't have our diplomats overseas being targeted. And in order to do that most efficiently, we need to collaborate with the Cuban government to figure out, what they know, we know, and then share notes, which isn't happening at this time. I would also mention that, again, consistency in our policy and our actions. The same event happened in a province of China, where a U.S. diplomat was targeted. And it seems to be the same mechanism that happened in Cuba. But our reaction in China was that we were instantly going to work with the Chinese government to figure out who did it. But we're not doing that in Cuba. So it really exposes our duplicity and then leads us further away from actually finding out who did this. Because we can't obviously allow this to happen in any country in the world.
Thanks, Paul. Question for David. What can companies do if they feel a general license would apply to potential transactions, but they're not certain that the U.S. government would agree?
Sure. Yeah. There's a couple mechanisms under the regulations that allow companies to get more certainty. Oftentimes they're not quick, but you can informally approach either agency and talk it through with them, and generally they will be responsive. At least they'll talk with you about it. Sometimes they're nervous to take any sort of position on a proposed transaction informally, and it's difficult to rely on informal guidance from an agency for obvious reasons. You can also apply formally to OFAC and BIS to say, here's what we plan on doing. Is this consistent with your regulations? And sometimes, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll apply for a specific license, lay out what you're proposing to do, and ask the agency to give you an export license to do it. And if they look at your application and feel that what you're proposing to do is consistent with their regulations and doesn't need to be licensed, they'll return it as a no action required. They'll say, we've looked at your application, we feel that it's consistent with our regulations, and a lot of times corporate clients will choose to do that, notwithstanding the loss of time that it may take. OFAC can take quite a while to issue such guidance or authorization, but it is an option for U.S. companies to alleviate the uncertainty, and particularly in the BIS regulations, there are aspects of it that are vague and ambiguous in terms of how how do you actually confirm that what you're proposing to do is consistent with the regulations? So you, in a lot of instances, can get official guidance from the agency on that it's permissible.
Thanks. Another question from the audience. My son and his wife just returned from Cuba yesterday. They stayed at an Airbnb. How did Airbnb negotiate that?
Go ahead.
Well, it was a long process. And by the way, this is helping the Cuban people directly because we are talking about private homes. As I mentioned before, when you send 1 million of 1 million of people from the United States, 600,000 Americans, 400,000 Cuban Americans, and we had a million of Canadians and people from Europe, and we didn't have enough rooms in Cuba. So, and people was asking for the opportunity to offer their homes. And Airbnb came to the embassy, started the negotiations, and by the way, they report that they have paid to Cuban people, I don't remember how many millions of dollars because of this. So this is a direct example of working with the Cuban people, with the private sector in Cuba. Now with this change, and because President Obama allows the people-to-people personal trip, you can go at that time, only you, and say, I am going under the people-to-people license. Right now, you need to go as a group. So the people that is suffering that is the same people that offer their homes, because in your home, you probably can host 1, 2, 3 people, but you cannot host a whole group. So that was a negotiation, and the banks here have the license to send the money to the private people in Cuba, and it's working wonderful. Unfortunately, with this new moment of the relation, with the travel warning, with the idea that now you need a group to go, now there is some people that sees difficulties. But we believe that if we can change that, it's going to be amazing for the Cuban people.
Yeah, there's a few different authorizations under the Cuban sanctions that would potentially allow Airbnb to do that. One is if they're providing services related to authorized travel, that would generally be permissible in assisting a traveler to arrange housing or lodging. And the way Airbnb is set up, you're essentially dealing with a Cuban household, right? So they would be considered an independent entrepreneur, I guess, that would be allowed to sell a service that Airbnb could provide. I think, as First Secretary Fraga noted, it's trickier now because almost travel has to be done under the auspices of an organization with a mission or some other institutional arrangement. It can't just be a person deciding to go to Cuba. And, that makes it tricky for a company like Airbnb to make sure that any services they're providing are consistent with authorized travel.
Another question. I think this would be a good one to start with Paul, given your long time studying Cuba and all the time you've spent there. The question is, the potential benefits of lifting the embargo and normalizing relations between the U.S. and Cuba have been made clear. My question is Cuba ready for the repercussions, such as economic, political, and social, that come with full stop normalization? And maybe a follow-up point for First Secretary Fraga to answer, which is, how has the Cuban government prepared for these changes? What actions have been taken? So first, Paul, how do you think it's going to affect Cuba?
Well, a tsunami, a tidal wave, right? And, I think they're prepared for it. I think they want it. I think that, you talk to Cubans and, they recognize the challenges that come with dealing with the United States, but, they're looking for a new problem. I think that it's going to be a challenge, even if the embargo ended today. We're going to have to work through 50 years of miscommunication which isn't easy to do. I think on the agricultural front, it's going to be a challenge to work with small farms in Cuba that adhere to the agroecological principles of farming, and what that means for those farmers when the United States agriculture wants to do more trade. I think that debate is also happening here in the United States. It's no different than what's taking place within Cuba. But I think there's a path forward to make both sides happy. I think that comparative trade advantage is the way to go. I think that Cuba can't grow certain grains given the climate, given the fact that they're prone to many hurricanes. So it would behoove them to purchase more goods from the Midwest here in the United States that we do really well. I mean, there's a University of Illinois that spends $1 billion in research on soybeans alone. Cuba can't compete with that, nor should they. They should really focus on organic farming, I believe. I think that'd be a market not only for them internally, but for tourists and to export to the United States. They do a lot of products that we don't do, including tobacco and rum, and I mentioned organics and aquaculture, I think, has a great future. So the answer to your question is I think it's going to be a big challenge, but something that certainly the Cubans would embrace and look for. And one more point to that. The United States, North Americans and Cubans are very similar. I believe they're the closest ally than any other country, in the world. I believe that firmly from the Cuban side. That's been my experience. Pretty much everybody's got an aunt, brother, or a grandmother living in Miami or Jersey, so they're very familiar with the United States. And so I do see that as challenging as we merge these two systems, but something that can certainly be done.
Well, it's a very important question. 70% of the Cuban population was born after 1959. So we don't know, and I include that number. I was born in 1979. We don't know another reality. We don't know how is to live without the U.S. embargo. But we are not afraid of that. We believe, it's better to have a new challenge and not to keep to be living under the U.S. embargo. And somebody, I remember in 2015 when everything was great and people was with so much hope in both countries, somebody approached me in one university and told me, "Are you ready for the invasion of the Americans?" And I say, well, it's going to be better than Bay of Pigs, That was a real invasion, and that is the reality. We put always humor because it's what we are in Cuba. As Johnson mentioned, we have so much in common. We don't hate. Despite all these 50 years of difference, Cubans don't hate Americans. I visited Seattle in 2016, and I am making a presentation, and I say, Seattle is famous in Cuba because people believe that Cuba is, we don't know nothing about the United States, we don't know nothing what is happening. And I say, Seattle is famous in Cuba. People, are you sure? And I say, yes, we love Grey's Anatomy. We see Grey's Anatomy almost every week in Cuba. We see your movies, we see your TV series, we heard to your music. And I know that there is concern. Are you going to miss? Are you going to change? Are you going to? And I say, no, our national identity is there. We still wear our guayaberas. We still do what we do in our country. But yes, it's going to be a new challenge, but we cannot be afraid of that. For that reason, every time that people say, okay, this is an excuse, you don't want the relation, we say, what else we can do? Why we are here this morning? To say to everybody, go to Cuba. Let's work together. We don't need to wait to tomorrow. I don't want to wait. So the question is, yes, it's going probably to be a huge challenge. Many, imagine, right now, we cannot sometimes have time for all the universities that want to go to Cuba, for all the business that comes to our embassy to propose something. But that is better than what we are living right now. You know, the reality of the relation between both countries, you know. So for that reason, according to the Washington Post, the majority of the Cuban people also support the relation between Cuba and the United States.
Well, we could end just right there, but I'm going to ask one more question. There are two questions on this topic. I still missed a few. Apologies. You will have a time afterwards to come up and talk to the panel if you'd like. I think they'll stick around for a bit longer. So the last question is, and try to say this in a sentence, not a lawyer's sentence, but a normal human being sentence. What can we do to help others we interact with to understand the importance of relations with Cuba, and what steps can we take to help end the embargo?
Oh, you could finish. How's that?
Okay, perfect.
Read your history. You know, much of what's taking place today, you know, our decisions that we make on the diplomatic and the commercial front today have been narrowed because of our decisions that were made in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. Go back and read your history to get a better understanding of where we are today and learn from the past so we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Difficult to answer in one sentence. It's a two-part
Save
question.
the lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, you know, the kinds of things that Paul is doing, supporting those who are advocating on behalf of the cause to have more activity between the two countries, support them, you know, engage with your elected officials.
I totally agree with both, but I want to say that, and again, my point is we need to work together, and we need people from the United States to go to Cuba, to see the real Cuba, to know what is happening in our country. 1959, some people say this is only 6 months. They are going to collapse. After Bay of Pigs, they say the problem is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is there. The Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. After that, the same people said the problem is Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is there. After Fidel, well, Fidel was not in power since 2006. And the same people keep repeating, the problem is Raúl Castro. Well, Raúl Castro is no longer the president of Cuba. We don't need new excuses. We need to work together. And the door is open on our side. We only want goodwill and respect, and we can accomplish a lot. Thank you so much.
That's right.
Thank you so much. It's difficult.
Thank you. Nice job. So quickly before you leave, again, lawyers, you've got your green sheets to sign if you want CLE credit. I want to thank all of you for coming and thank the panelists for a great, engaging program. Have a great day.